London, July 1818. The night air at Vauxhall Gardens hung thick with the mingled scents of roses and lamp oil, while masked figures drifted through shadowed pathways like spirits escaped from some Gothic tale. Miss Georgiana Sutton stood near an arrangement of climbing roses, her plain domino cloak doing little to conceal the modest quality of her gown beneath, and wondered for the third time that evening why she had received an invitation bearing the Wycliffe crest. At 23, Georgiana understood precisely what polite society thought of her. The daughter of Sir Edmund Sutton, who had fled to the continent 5 years ago under suspicion of treason, leaving his family to rot in shame and poverty. No matter that she had been innocent, that she had volunteered at the Foundling Hospital every Tuesday and Thursday for years, that her character was beyond reproach. The stain of her father's betrayal clung to her like perfume, impossible to wash away. With her aunt, her only living relative, confined as an invalid in distant Cornwall, Georgiana was entirely alone in the world. 3 men emerged from the darker paths beyond, their movements purposeful and predatory: Lord Ravenscar, Sir Neville Crofton, and Mr. Hartley Vane. Georgiana felt her blood turn cold as they surrounded the secluded arbor where she stood, cutting off any path of escape. If stories of vengeance and love that transforms even the coldest hearts move you, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. Lord Ravenscar spoke first, his voice carrying the rough edges of too much wine. "Miss Sutton, how unexpected to find you here. One would think an invitation to Vauxhall Gardens rather above your current station." "I was invited," Georgiana said quietly, though her fingers trembled as they tightened on her fan. "I have every right to be here." "Rights?" Sir Neville Crofton laughed, the sound harsh and ugly. "Your father owed my father £5,000 when he fled. A debt of honor, Miss Sutton, does not vanish simply because a man runs away. And since there is no male heir to answer for his cowardice, we have decided to collect from you." "That is not the law," Georgiana protested, backing away until she hit the trellis. "I am not responsible for my father's personal wagers." "We are not in a court of law," Vane sneered, stepping closer. "We are in the dark, and you have no one to defend you." Before Georgiana could scream or run, Ravenscar's hand struck her cheek with brutal force. The impact sent her stumbling backward into the roses, thorns catching at her gown and scratching her arms. She tasted blood where her lip had split against her teeth. "You thought you could hide behind your volunteer work?" Vane hissed. "Thought you could smile at the Marquess of Wycliffe in the park and he would save you? You are nothing but the daughter of a traitor." Crofton's boot caught her in the ribs as she tried to rise. Pain exploded through her chest, stealing her breath. She felt her gown tear as Ravenscar grabbed the delicate muslin and threw her down into the mud between the rose bushes. More thorns bit into her palms as she tried to catch herself. "Tell Wycliffe his protection ends tonight," Ravenscar said, his voice cold and deliberate. "Tell him to stay away from traitors' daughters. You are nothing, and you will always be nothing." The sound of carriage wheels on gravel made all 3 men freeze. They exchanged glances, then fled into the darkness like rats escaping a sinking ship, leaving Georgiana bleeding and broken among the roses. She tried to stand, but her legs would not hold her weight. Her vision swam with tears and pain. Blood dripped from her lip onto the torn bodice of her gown. Her left eye was already swelling shut, and every breath sent fire through her bruised ribs. The carriage stopped somewhere beyond her line of sight. She heard footsteps, crisp and measured, approaching through the garden paths. Then a tall figure appeared at the entrance to the arbor, silhouetted against the lamplight behind him. Lord Wycliffe, the Marquess of Wycliffe, stopped so suddenly it was as if he had walked into an invisible wall. He should have been there an hour ago, had a carriage wheel not splintered on the road from Westminster, a delay that now felt like a curse. His steel-gray eyes took in the scene with the efficiency of a military commander assessing a battlefield. The torn gown, the blood on her face, the defensive way she held her ribs, the mud on her knees, the thorns embedded in her palms. Something ancient and lethal awakened in his expression. The temperature in the garden seemed to drop 10 degrees. When he moved, it was not with panic, but with the controlled precision of a predator who had just found his prey wounded. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides and knelt beside her in the mud without regard for his immaculate evening clothes. His hand came up to lift her chin, tilting her face toward the lamplight so he could study every mark. His touch was clinical, yet terrifyingly gentle. "Who did this to you?" His voice was soft, therefore terrifying, the kind of quiet that preceded storms. Georgiana tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Fear, pain, and something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. "Who?" he asked again, and now she could hear the iron beneath the silk. "Give me their names." "Lord Ravenscar," she whispered. "Sir Neville Crofton, Mr. Hartley Vane. They said I owed them a debt of honor. They said your protection ends tonight." For a moment, Lord Wycliffe said nothing. He simply looked at her with those storm cloud eyes, and Georgiana saw something shift in their depths. A decision being made. A line being crossed from which there could be no return. Then he stood, sweeping his greatcoat from his shoulders. He wrapped it around her trembling form, lifting her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. She made a small sound of pain as the movement jarred her ribs, and his arms immediately adjusted, finding a position that caused her less discomfort. "I am taking you to Wycliffe House," he said, his voice returning to its usual controlled tone. "Mrs. Dalton will see to your injuries. You will stay there until you are healed. Do not argue with me." Georgiana knew the scandal such an arrangement would cause. A single woman staying in the home of a bachelor Marquess would be ruined beyond repair. But looking at the set of his jaw, she realized she was already ruined in the eyes of the world. She had nothing left to lose. She let her head rest against his shoulder as he carried her to his carriage, breathing in the scent of sandalwood and something uniquely him. She had loved this man from a distance for 5 years, watching him at church, glimpsing him in the park during her morning walks, never daring to hope he noticed her existence. The carriage ride passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. Wycliffe held her carefully, one arm supporting her shoulders, the other beneath her knees. He did not speak, but she could feel the tension radiating from his body like heat from a forge. At Wycliffe House, he carried her straight through the entrance hall, ignoring the shocked expressions of his footmen. Mrs. Dalton, his housekeeper for 20 years, took one look at Georgiana's battered face and immediately began issuing orders for hot water, clean linens, and medical supplies. The Marquess set Georgiana down on a chaise in one of the guest bedchambers with infinite care. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then turned and walked toward the door. "My lord?" Mrs. Dalton called after him. "Where are you going at this hour?" "Out," Wycliffe said. "I have errands to attend to. See that Miss Sutton has everything she needs." Then he was gone, and Georgiana heard his footsteps echoing down the marble stairs, followed by the sound of the front door closing with quiet finality. Mrs. Dalton clucked her tongue as she began cleaning Georgiana's wounds with warm water and applying cooling plasters to the bruises. "Never seen him look like that," she murmured. "Not in all the years I have known him. Someone is going to pay dearly for this night's work." What Mrs. Dalton did not know, what no one in London yet understood, was that the Marquess of Wycliffe had already begun. It was 2 hours past midnight when Wycliffe's carriage stopped before a modest townhouse in Holborn, where Mr. Samuel Finch, his solicitor, kept his offices and private quarters. The building was dark, but the Marquess pounded on the door until a bleary-eyed clerk appeared, candle in hand. "Wake Mr. Finch," Wycliffe said without preamble. "Tell him the Marquess of Wycliffe requires his immediate assistance on a matter of utmost urgency." 20 minutes later, Samuel Finch sat across from the Marquess in his cluttered office, wearing a hastily donned banyan over his nightshirt, listening with increasing alarm as Wycliffe outlined his requirements. I need every record of debt held by Lord Ravenscar, Sir Neville Crofton, and Mr. Hartley Vane, Wycliffe said, his voice as cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. Every note, every marker, every unpaid bill. I need to know who holds their vowels, who they owe money to, what properties they hold, and under what terms. I need the names of their mistresses, their tavern keepers, their tailors. I need everything, and I need it by dawn. Finch stared at him. My lord, such information would take weeks to compile properly. You have 6 hours, Wycliffe said. I will pay triple your usual fee. Hire runners if you must. Wake every clerk in London. But I will have those ledgers before the sun rises. The solicitor looked into those steel-gray eyes and saw something that made him reach immediately for his coat. I shall begin at once, my lord. Wycliffe's next stop was a tavern in 7 Dials, a rough establishment where information could be purchased along with the watered gin. He found Sergeant Briggs, a retired military man who had served under the Marquess's late brother in the peninsula, sitting in a back corner nursing a pint. My lord, Briggs said, rising immediately. Did not expect to see you in this part of town. I need men, Wycliffe said, sliding into the seat across from him. Reliable men who can watch 3 houses without being observed. Men who will report every visitor, every letter, every movement. Can you provide such men? Briggs studied his former commander's face and nodded slowly. How many do you need? 6. 2 for each house. They start tonight. May I ask what this is about? No, Wycliffe said. But you may ask how much I am willing to pay. By 3 in the morning, the Marquess stood in the private study of Lord Bartholomew Hawthorne, who owned the largest private bank in Mayfair. Hawthorne sat behind his massive desk in his dressing gown, looking distinctly uncomfortable at being roused from sleep by a Marquess with murder in his eyes. Lord Ravenscar holds several notes with your bank, does he not? Wycliffe asked without pleasantries. I cannot discuss the private financial affairs of my clients, Hawthorne protested weakly. Wycliffe placed a bank draft on the desk. The amount written there made Hawthorne's eyes widen. Consider this an incentive for your memory to improve. Ravenscar's notes, I want them called in, tomorrow morning. But my lord, such an action would ruin him. His estates are mortgaged to the hilt. If we call those notes, he will be bankrupt within a week. Yes, Wycliffe said softly, he will. Hawthorne looked at the draft, then at the Marquess's face, and quietly unlocked a drawer in his desk. At 4 in the morning, Wycliffe visited a printing house on Fleet Street, where the owner, a former soldier named John Graves, owed him a considerable debt of gratitude. Within the hour, type was being set for a special broadsheet to be distributed at dawn. The headline would read simply, Evidence of extensive forgery and financial fraud in the estates of Lord Ravenscar. The content would list in excruciating detail every forged vowel, every counterfeit signature, and every criminal transaction conducted by Lord Ravenscar over the past 5 years. This was no longer a matter of debt. It was a hanging offense, or at the very least, grounds for permanent exile. The sources were impeccable. The facts were irrefutable. The timing was devastating. At 5 in the morning, Wycliffe stood before Sir William Cavendish, a magistrate at Bow Street, and quietly explained that certain gentlemen had committed assault and battery against a lady under the Marquess of Wycliffe's protection. He provided exact times, locations, and several witnesses who had seen the 3 men fleeing Vauxhall Gardens in suspicious haste. Warrants would be drawn up immediately. At 5:30, Wycliffe visited the Bishop of London in his residence near St. Paul's. The elderly clergyman listened with grave concern as the Marquess explained that Sir Neville Crofton's younger brother, a vicar in Kent, had gambling debts that threatened to cost him his living. The bishop, who took a dim view of gambling clergy, made a note to investigate the matter personally. Between each of these errands, Wycliffe returned to Wycliffe House. He would pause outside the guest bedchamber where Georgiana slept, listening for the sound of her breathing. Only when he heard that steady rhythm would he leave again, mounting his horse and riding back into the darkness to continue his work. Dawn broke over London like a pale promise. Wycliffe had not slept. He had not eaten. He had spent the night circling the city like an avenging angel, speaking to 12 different men, signing papers, making arrangements. He had not threatened anyone. He had not raised his voice. He had used no weapons save debt, disgrace, and the weight of his reputation. But the weapon he had forged in the darkness was sharper than any blade. Lord Ravenscar woke that morning to the sound of shouting in the street. He went to his window to find broadsheets being hawked outside his Mayfair townhouse. His valet burst into the room, face ashen, clutching one of the papers. Ravenscar snatched it, his eyes scanning the headline. "Forgery," it read. He collapsed into a chair. This was not merely ruin. This was a death sentence. Every debt, every forgery, every questionable transaction was laid bare for all of London to see. Before noon, the runners would be at his door. By evening, he would be in chains. Sir Neville Crofton came down to breakfast to find a letter from Lord Hawthorne's bank on his silver platter. His estate mortgage had been called in. The loan was due immediately, in full. His hands trembled as he read the terms. He had 60 days to produce £30,000, or everything would be seized. He looked around his breakfast room, at the paintings he would have to sell, the silver he would have to melt down, and realized with dawning horror that even that would not be enough. Mr. Hartley Vane woke in his bachelor rooms to discover that his carefully cultivated investments had somehow become worthless overnight. His vowels had been called in by creditors he had not known existed. His uncle, who had previously tolerated his spendthrift ways, had sent a terse note disowning him. His mistress had left during the night, taking her jewels with her. His tailor refused him credit. By mid-morning, the gentlemen's clubs of St. James were buzzing with speculation. Who had done this? Who possessed both the resources and the ruthlessness to orchestrate such comprehensive ruin? The name Wycliffe was never spoken aloud, but it hung in the air like smoke, unspoken but understood. Everyone knew. Everyone feared. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in systematic destruction. Wycliffe moved through society with his usual cold precision, but now there was something else beneath the ice, something that made even his oldest acquaintances step carefully around him. Lord Ravenscar fought the charges with increasing desperation, but the evidence of forgery was overwhelming. His friends became suddenly unavailable. His petitions to Parliament were quietly shelved. Within a month, his estates were seized, his titles stripped for felony, and he found himself facing transportation to New South Wales for the term of his natural life. Sir Neville Crofton lasted slightly longer. He sold everything he owned, including family heirlooms that had been passed down for generations. But it was not enough. The mortgage was called, the property seized, and he was forced to accept a living in the remote Scottish Highlands, so far from civilization that no road connected him to polite society. He would live out his days in exile, forgotten and alone. But Mr. Hartley Vane was different. Vane had been the architect of the attack, the one who had chosen the location, who had told Ravenscar where to strike, who had watched from the shadows as Georgiana was beaten. Wycliffe had confirmed this through careful investigation, through bribes paid to servants and innkeepers, through patient reconstruction of that terrible night. And so Wycliffe saved Vane for last. He let Ravenscar fall first, let Crofton flee into exile, let Vane believe he had somehow escaped notice, let him think his role in the attack had gone undetected, let him relax, let him begin to hope. Then, when Vane's guard was completely down, Wycliffe sprang the trap. It was a Thursday evening in late August when the Marquess entered White's club. The main room was moderately full, gentlemen scattered at various tables enjoying port and conversation. Vane sat alone near the fireplace, reading a newspaper, probably calculating how much of his former circle's misfortune he could leverage to his own advantage. Wycliffe walked directly to Vane's table without removing his greatcoat, the dark fabric making him look like a shadow come to life. He sat down in the chair opposite, moving with such deliberate slowness that every eye in the room turned to watch. The club fell silent. "Mr. Vane," Wycliffe said, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed space, "how fortuitous to find you here." Vane's face went pale, but he attempted a smile. "Lord Wycliffe, an unexpected pleasure." "Is it?" Wycliffe leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other with casual elegance. "I have been hoping for the opportunity to speak with you privately." "Well, privately enough." He let the words hang in the air. Several gentlemen near the fireplace quietly moved away, not wanting to be associated with whatever was about to happen. "You planned it," Wycliffe continued, his tone conversational. "The attack at Vauxhall Gardens. You chose the location. You told Ravenscar where to strike. You watched from the shadows as 3 grown men beat a defenseless woman bloody. You stood there and did nothing while they kicked her in the ribs and threw her into the thorns." "I do not know what you are talking about," Vane stammered, his hands gripping the arms of his chair until his knuckles turned white. "Do not insult me with lies," Wycliffe said softly. "Lord Ravenscar is bound for the colonies in chains. Sir Neville Crofton has been exiled to Scotland, so remote that no mail coach reaches him. Your friends have fallen, Mr. Vane, one by one. Did you think you had escaped?" Vane's breathing grew shallow. "What do you want?" "Want?" Wycliffe's smile was terrible to behold. "I want nothing you can give, Mr. Vane, but you owe a debt, and debts must be paid." He stood, moving to stand behind Vane's chair so that his shadow fell across the smaller man. "Your vowels have all been called as of this morning. Your uncle has disowned you. Your mistress has left you. Your tailor has refused you credit. I have here a list of every club, every establishment, every shop in London that will refuse you entry beginning tomorrow morning." He placed a folded paper on the table beside Vane's trembling hand. "But I am not a monster, Mr. Vane. I am willing to offer you a choice. Leave England tonight. Never write to Miss Sutton. Never speak her name. Never return while I draw breath. Do this, and I will provide you passage to the continent and enough funds to establish yourself in some small way." "And if I refuse?" Vane's voice cracked. Wycliffe leaned down, his mouth close to Vane's ear. "Then the next time I deal with you, it will not be with ink and whispers. Do we understand each other?" Vane was shaking visibly now. "Please," he whispered, the sound barely audible in the quiet room. "Louder," Wycliffe commanded, his voice slicing through the silence. "Please, Lord Wycliffe, I beg you, show mercy." The words echoed through the silent club. Every man present would remember this moment, would carry the story to every drawing room in London. They would speak of the ice Marquess who had destroyed 3 men without raising his voice or his fist, who had orchestrated ruin with nothing more than ledgers and letters. Wycliffe straightened, adjusting his cuffs. "You mistook silence for weakness, Mr. Vane, both hers and mine. Remember this, whatever soil you choose to rot in. The debt is paid, but the lesson is eternal." He walked out of White's without looking back, leaving Vane slumped in his chair like a puppet with cut strings. By morning, Vane would be on a ship bound for Calais, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the memory of his own humiliation. The coach Wycliffe had arranged for him would be waiting at dawn. The ticket would be non-refundable. The accommodations would be adequate, but far from comfortable. Vane would arrive in France with just enough money to survive, but not enough to ever return to the life he had known. It was, Wycliffe reflected as he rode through the London streets toward Wycliffe House, exactly the mercy such a man deserved, which was to say, none at all. While the Marquess had been meticulously destroying the 3 men who had dared harm her, Georgiana had been healing at Wycliffe House under Mrs. Dalton's fierce and tender care. The housekeeper had proven herself as skilled as any apothecary, applying fresh poultices to the bruises and binding the cuts with careful precision, bullying Georgiana into eating proper meals even when her swollen jaw made chewing painful. The first week had been the worst. Every breath hurt. Every movement sent fire through her ribs. Her face had swollen so badly that she could barely see out of her left eye. She spent most of those days sleeping, drifting in and out of fevered dreams where roses turned to thorns and voices whispered that she was nothing, would always be nothing. But Mrs. Dalton was there every time Georgiana woke, with cool cloths for her forehead and warm broth for her throat. The housekeeper spoke little, but her actions carried volumes. Mrs. Dalton served as both nurse and chaperone, her constant presence the only thing standing between Georgiana and total social ruin. By the second week, Georgiana could sit up without gasping. The swelling in her face had receded enough that she could see clearly again, though the bruises had faded from black to spectacular shades of purple and green. Mrs. Dalton brought her books from the library, newspapers to read, and occasionally reports on the spectacular falls of 3 certain gentlemen. Georgiana listened to these accounts with mixed feelings. She had not asked for vengeance. She had not requested that Wycliffe destroy these men so completely. Part of her felt almost sorry for them, for the wives and children who would suffer alongside the guilty. But then she would remember the sound of Ravenscar's hand striking her face, the feel of Crofton's boot in her ribs, the cold satisfaction in Vane's voice as he told her she was nothing. And she would think, perhaps this is justice after all. She did not see Wycliffe during those weeks. Mrs. Dalton mentioned that his lordship was attending to business matters, that he checked on her progress each evening, but did not wish to disturb her rest. Georgiana understood. He had saved her, had brought her to his home, had clearly set in motion the machinery that was grinding her attackers to dust. But beyond that, she had no claim on him. She was still Miss Sutton, daughter of a trader, living on charity in the house of a Marquess. She had loved him from a distance for 5 years, and distance was likely where she would remain. On a gray morning in early September, as rain pattered against the windows of her borrowed room, Georgiana finally felt strong enough to leave the bed for more than brief walks to the adjoining sitting room. She dressed carefully in one of the simple gowns Mrs. Dalton had procured for her, brushing her hair with slow, methodical strokes until it gleamed in the dim light. She studied her reflection in the mirror. The bruises were nearly gone now, faded to yellowish shadows that could be hidden with rice powder. The cut on her lip had healed to a thin pink line. Her ribs no longer ached with every breath. Physically, she was nearly whole again. But something had changed inside her during those long weeks of healing. Some core of steel had formed where before there had been only resigned acceptance of society's judgment. She had been beaten, yes. She had been broken, but she had not stayed broken. She would not apologize for existing. She would not shrink from the world anymore. A knock sounded at her door. "Miss Sutton," Mrs. Dalton called. "His lordship has returned and requests the pleasure of your company in the library, if you are feeling well enough." Georgiana's heart stuttered. "Tell him I shall be down directly." She took her time descending the grand staircase, one hand trailing along the polished banister, her feet silent on the thick runner. The house was beautiful in the way of old money and careful stewardship. Nothing ostentatious, but everything perfect. Paintings of previous marquesses lined the walls, their stern faces watching her progress. The library door stood open. Wycliffe sat behind a massive desk covered in papers, his dark head bent over some document or another. He looked tired, she thought. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there before, and his face had acquired new lines of tension around his mouth. He glanced up as she entered, and something flickered across his expression too quickly for her to identify. Then the familiar mask of control descended, and he rose to his feet with perfect courtesy. "Miss Sutton," he said, "Mrs. Dalton tells me you are much improved." "Thanks to her excellent care," Georgiana replied, "and to your generosity in providing me sanctuary. Though I fear my presence here has compromised your reputation as much as my own." "My reputation can withstand anything," he said dismissively. "It is yours that concerns me." He gestured to a chair near the fireplace. "Please, sit. We have matters to discuss." Georgiana settled into the indicated chair, her hands folded primly in her lap. Wycliffe remained standing, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, his gaze directed at the flames rather than at her. "I imagine you have heard various accounts of what has transpired over the past weeks," he began. "Some," Georgiana admitted. "Mrs. Dalton is not given to gossip, but news does filter through the servants' quarters." "Then you know that the 3 men who attacked you have been dealt with." "I know that they have been ruined," Georgiana said carefully. "I know that you orchestrated their destruction." Wycliffe finally turned to look at her. "Does that trouble you? Should it? Some would say I went too far, that bankruptcy and exile are excessive punishments for one night's violence." Georgiana met his eyes steadily. "And what would you say?" "I would say they are fortunate I am civilized," Wycliffe replied, his voice dropping to that soft, dangerous register she remembered from Vauxhall Gardens. "There are countries where what they did to you would have earned them a bullet, not a bankruptcy. I did not ask you to ruin them for me." "No," Wycliffe agreed, "you did not ask, but neither did you deserve what they did, and I could not let such an offense pass unanswered." He moved away from the fireplace, pacing to the window that overlooked the gardens. Rain blurred the glass, turning the world outside into a watercolor painting. "There is something you should know, Miss Sutton. Something I should have told you years ago, but I am not a man given to easy declarations." Georgiana's heart began to beat faster. "My lord?" "For 5 years, I have watched you," Wycliffe said, still not looking at her. "I saw you first at church, wearing a gown that had been mended so many times it was more thread than fabric, sitting alone in the back pew because your father's disgrace had cost you your friends. You held your head high despite the whispers. You sang the hymns with a voice like morning light. And I thought, there is a woman of uncommon courage." He turned to face her now, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "I began to encounter you more frequently after that. In the park, during your morning walks. At the lending library, outside the Foundling Hospital where you volunteered. I kept my distance because I knew my attention would only bring you further scrutiny. I fought against the impulse to approach you, telling myself it was for your own good. I imposed an exile upon myself, watching you from the shadows, ensuring you were safe without ever daring to step into your light." "Why?" Georgiana whispered. "Because you reminded me that strength does not require armor," Wycliffe said simply. "Because in a world of painted faces and false smiles, you were genuine. Because I had built my life on ice and discipline after my brother died, and you were warmth without even trying." He crossed the room to stand before her chair. "I became your anonymous benefactor without your knowledge. I ensured bills were paid, that certain invitations found their way to you. I protected you from a distance because I did not trust myself to approach you directly. I feared what I might do, what I might say. I feared my own capacity for feeling, because feeling meant vulnerability, and I had sworn never to be vulnerable again." Georgiana stared up at him, her mind reeling. "You have been protecting me for 5 years? You were the one who ensured the landlord did not raise the rent?" "Yes." "The invitation to Vauxhall Gardens, that was from you?" "Yes, though I deeply regret it now. I had hoped to speak with you there to finally make my interest known. Instead, I delivered you into danger." "That was not your fault," Georgiana said firmly. "You could not have known those men would attack me." "I should have provided better protection. I should have been there sooner." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "When I saw you bleeding in those roses, when I understood what had been done to you, something broke inside me, or perhaps it finally healed. I cannot say which." "My lord," Georgiana began, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish, please. I need to say this while I still have the courage." He drew a breath. "I destroyed those men, yes. I ruined them completely and without remorse. I did it because they dared to harm you, because they thought you were unprotected, because they believed your lack of social standing made you fair prey. I wanted them to understand the cost of that mistake. I wanted every man in London to understand. His voice dropped. But I also did it for myself, because the thought of them walking free while you suffered was unbearable. Because I needed them to pay for every bruise, every tear, every moment of fear they caused you. I needed the world to know that you are under my protection, and that protection is absolute. Georgiana felt tears pricking her eyes. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve the truth. Because you have spent 5 years believing yourself unworthy, and I cannot bear it any longer. He knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. The gesture was so unexpected, so profoundly unlike the Ice Marquess's usual reserve, that Georgiana could only stare. You are not unworthy, Georgiana Sutton, Julian said, using his given name in her presence for the first time, his voice rough with emotion. You are extraordinary. You are brave and kind and true in a world that values none of those things. Your father's crimes are not yours to bear. His dishonor does not diminish your honor, and any man who cannot see that is a fool. I am still a traitor's daughter, Georgiana said, though her voice trembled. I have no dowry, no prospects, no family worth mentioning. And now, having lived under your roof for weeks, I am a scandal. If you marry me, society will shun you. They will say the Ice Marquess has lost his wits. Let them scandalize, Julian said fiercely. Let them whisper and gossip and disapprove. Their opinions mean less than nothing to me. Do you think I care for the approval of a society that allowed you to suffer? I possess title, wealth, and power enough for both of us. No one will dare slight you while you stand by my side. But your reputation? My reputation is a shield, Georgiana, nothing more. It is cold comfort in a lonely house. I would trade it all for a single smile from you. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. When he opened it, Georgiana saw a ring of gold with an inlay of black enamel, set with a single perfect diamond, the Wycliffe Raven crest engraved inside the band. Marry me, Julian said. Not because I saved you, not because you need my protection, but because I cannot imagine another dawn without you beside me. You have made me a man instead of a monument, Georgiana. You have taught me that love is not weakness, but the greatest strength. I offer you my name, my fortune, my life, and my heart. Such as it is, it has been yours for 5 years. I am only now brave enough to admit it. Georgiana stared at him, at this powerful man kneeling before her like a supplicant at an altar. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. You are certain? You understand what it would mean? There will be no turning back. I have never been more certain of anything in my life, Julian said. Say yes, Georgiana, please. Then yes, Georgiana said, her voice breaking with joy. Yes, Julian, 1,000 times yes. I love you. Not Lord Wycliffe the Marquess, not the legend they tell stories about in ballrooms, but you. The man who carried me through the rain. The man who spent weeks orchestrating justice. The man who is kneeling before me now with his heart in his hands. She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and gentle, tasting salt from her tears and something sweeter beneath. He rose, drawing her up with him, his arms coming around her with careful strength. The kiss deepened, years of longing and denial pouring into that single moment of connection. When they finally drew apart, both breathing hard, Julian slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Perhaps it had been. Perhaps he had commissioned it years ago, hoping one day to have the courage to offer it. We will marry soon, Julian said, his forehead resting against hers. I have already procured a special license from the Archbishop. We need not wait for the banns. I have waited 5 years to call you mine. I will not wait a moment longer than necessary. A special license? Georgiana asked, breathless. You were that confident? I was that desperate, he admitted with a faint smile. Though we should write to your aunt in Cornwall. She will want to know, despite her inability to travel. She will be relieved, Georgiana said. "She has worried for my future since the day my father fled." "Her worry is at an end," Julian promised, "as is yours." They stood together by the rain-washed window, wrapped in each other's arms, while outside the storm gradually cleared and weak sunlight broke through the clouds. Somewhere in London, 3 ruined men were facing the consequences of their cruelty. Somewhere in Mayfair, drawing rooms were buzzing with speculation about the Marquess of Wycliffe's upcoming nuptials. But in the library of Wycliffe House, none of that mattered. Only this: 2 people who had been broken by life, by loss, by the cruel judgments of society, had found in each other a chance at wholeness, a chance at love, a chance at the happiness both had long believed impossible. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the private chapel at Wycliffe House. It was a small affair, attended only by Mrs. Dalton, a handful of Julian's closest associates, and the parish priest. Georgiana wore a gown of ivory silk that Julian had commissioned, simple but elegant, with seed pearls embroidered along the bodice and sleeves. She walked down the short aisle on her own, her head held high, her eyes fixed on the man waiting for her at the altar. Julian looked resplendent in dark blue superfine, his cravat tied with mathematical precision, his hair brushed back from his face. But it was his eyes that held her attention. Those storm-cloud eyes that had once seemed so cold now burned with warmth and promise. The ceremony was brief, traditional. The priest spoke the ancient words, and Georgiana and Julian made their vows in clear, steady voices. When the priest pronounced them man and wife, Julian lifted her veil with trembling hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made Mrs. Dalton dab at her eyes with a handkerchief. The wedding breakfast was served in the dining room, an intimate meal of excellent food and even better company. Mrs. Dalton presented them with a set of silver candlesticks that had belonged to Julian's grandmother. Even stern Mr. Finch, the solicitor who had worked through that terrible night compiling evidence, offered a toast to their future. As the afternoon wore on and the guests began to depart, Julian led Georgiana up the grand staircase to the Marchioness's suite. She had not yet seen these rooms, had been staying in the guest quarters throughout her recovery and the hasty wedding preparations. Now, as Julian opened the door and ushered her inside, she caught her breath. The chambers were beautiful, elegant without being ostentatious. Large windows overlooked the gardens. A canopied bed dominated one wall, hung with curtains of deep green velvet. A writing desk stood near the window, already stocked with paper and ink. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes she recognized from her visits to the lending library, plus many she had never seen. "I had Mrs. Dalton furnish the rooms according to what she knew of your tastes," Julian said, suddenly sounding uncertain. "If anything displeases you, it can be changed." "It is perfect," Georgiana breathed. She turned to find him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You are perfect." "I am far from perfect," Julian said, crossing the room to take her hands. "I am cold and controlled and far too comfortable with vengeance. I have made enemies and destroyed men and built walls around my heart that took you 5 years to breach." "Then it is fortunate I am patient," Georgiana replied, rising on her toes to kiss him. "And that I see through walls." He gathered her close, burying his face in her hair. "I will spend the rest of my life proving worthy of you." "You already are," she whispered. "You have always been." They stood together as the afternoon light faded and evening crept across the gardens. Outside, London continued its endless dance of scandal and society, ambition and intrigue. But here, in these rooms that were now theirs, Georgiana and Julian had found something infinitely more valuable than social standing or wealth. They had found each other. And that, as it turned out, was worth more than all the rest. The weeks following their wedding passed in a haze of happiness that Georgiana had never imagined possible. They remained in London initially, as Julian had business matters to conclude before they could retreat to his country estate for an extended honeymoon. But even the demands of Parliament and estate management could not dim the joy that permeated Wycliffe House. Georgiana discovered that marriage to the Ice Marquess was nothing like his cold reputation suggested. In private, Julian was attentive and tender, always careful of her comfort, constantly seeking ways to please her. He would leave small gifts on her writing desk, fresh flowers every morning, books he thought she might enjoy. Notes written in his precise, elegant hand expressing sentiments he still found difficult to speak aloud. In public, he was her fierce protector. The first time they attended a ball together as a married couple, Georgiana had been terrified. She knew what society would say about the match. A marquess and a traitor's daughter. It was scandalous, inappropriate, exactly the sort of thing that would set tongues wagging for months. But when they entered Lady Fairfax's ballroom, Julian kept her hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm. His expression dared anyone to comment. And when several matrons attempted to cut Georgiana directly, Julian simply steered her away to speak with his closest allies, who welcomed her warmly because their Marquess had chosen her. By the end of the evening, the same women who had intended to snub her were finding excuses to engage her in conversation. Because whatever else she might be, she was now the Marchioness of Wycliffe. And crossing the Marchioness meant crossing the Marquess, which no one in London was foolish enough to do. Georgiana found it amusing, in a bittersweet way. For 5 years, she had been invisible. Now, because of a ring on her finger and the man at her side, she had become someone worthy of notice. The irony was not lost on her, but she also understood that this was how their world worked. Power and position mattered. Reputation mattered. And Julian's reputation, cold and terrible though it might be, was now her shield as well as his. One morning in October, as they sat together in the breakfast room, Julian set down his newspaper with unusual abruptness. "There is something I should tell you," he said. "News arrived this morning from Calais." Georgiana looked up from her correspondence, a faint chill running down her spine. "What news?" "Mr. Hartley Vane is dead. His ship foundered in a storm 3 days after leaving port. There were no survivors." Georgiana set down her pen carefully. "I see." Julian studied her face. "Do you feel regret?" "Did she?" Georgiana examined her emotions as carefully as she had once examined her stitches at the Foundling Hospital, looking for any loose threads. She found none. "No," she said finally. "I feel sorrow that any life should end in such a manner. But I cannot say I grieve for Hartley Vane specifically. He made his choices. He must have known what the risks were, fleeing England in such haste." "He knew," Julian confirmed. "The captain I hired was experienced and the ship was sound. It was pure misfortune that they encountered that particular storm. Or perhaps it was justice of a different kind." "You do not believe in divine retribution?" "I do not know what I believe," Julian admitted. "But I am not sorry he is gone. Does that make me monstrous?" Georgiana rose from her seat and moved to stand beside him, placing her hand on his shoulder. "It makes you human. You protected what was yours. Some might call that monstrous. I call it love." He turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. "I do love you, Georgiana, more than I thought myself capable of loving anyone." "And I love you," she replied. "All of you. Even the parts you fear are too dark, too cold, too terrible to deserve affection. Especially those parts, perhaps." They remained like that for a long moment, drawing comfort from each other's presence. Outside, the October morning was crisp and bright, the kind of day that promised winter was coming but had not yet arrived. "We should leave for Wycliffe Manor soon," Julian said. "I promised you a honeymoon away from London's prying eyes, and I intend to keep that promise. The estate in Yorkshire is beautiful this time of year, remote, peaceful. We can stay until spring if you wish." "That sounds wonderful," Georgiana said, "though I should write to the Foundling Hospital first. The children will worry if I simply disappear." "Write to them," Julian agreed. Tell them their Miss Sutton has become Lady Wycliffe, but she has not forgotten them. When we return to London in the spring, we shall arrange for a proper endowment. The hospital does good work. It deserves better support." Georgiana smiled. "You are not nearly as cold as you pretend to be, my lord." "I am ruthless and calculating and entirely without mercy for those who deserve none," Julian corrected. "But for you and for those you care about, I find I am capable of great generosity. It is a most uncomfortable realization." "I think you secretly enjoy being uncomfortable," Georgiana teased. "It makes you feel alive." "You make me feel alive," Julian said, pulling her down into his lap despite the impropriety of such behavior in the breakfast room. "Everything else is merely existence." She laughed and kissed him, tasting coffee and marmalade and contentment. This man who had destroyed her enemies without hesitation, who had knelt before her with his heart exposed, who protected her with fierce devotion while treating her as an equal rather than a possession. This complicated, contradictory, utterly remarkable man was hers, and she was his, and that was a miracle greater than any she had dared to imagine. They departed for Yorkshire a week later, traveling north through England's autumn countryside. The journey took several days, with stops at comfortable inns along the way. Georgiana marveled at how different this trip was from any she had taken before. No cramped mail coaches or uncomfortable public conveyances. Instead, they traveled in Julian's well-sprung carriage, with servants to see to their every need and the finest rooms at each establishment. But more than the physical comfort, it was the emotional ease that struck her. Julian was endlessly patient with her curiosity, stopping whenever she wanted to see some interesting view or explore a particular village. He bought her a watercolor set at one market town, remembering her mentioning once that she had enjoyed painting as a girl but had been forced to give it up when her father's disgrace left them unable to afford supplies. When they finally arrived at Wycliffe Manor, Georgiana understood why Julian had been so eager to bring her here. The house itself was magnificent, but not overwhelming. Built of golden stone that glowed in the afternoon light, it stood on a rise, overlooking moorlands that stretched to the horizon. Gardens surrounded the main house, not the formal affairs of London, but wild tangles of roses and lavender that had been allowed to grow with cheerful abandon. The staff greeted them warmly. Mrs. Price, the housekeeper, was a comfortable woman with a Yorkshire accent so thick Georgiana had to concentrate to understand her. But her smile was genuine, and she clearly adored Julian, having known him since he was a boy. "Welcome home, my lord," Mrs. Price said, then turned to Georgiana with twinkling eyes. "And welcome to Wycliffe Manor, my lady. We are all so pleased his lordship has finally married. The house has been too quiet for too long." "Thank you, Mrs. Price," Georgiana said warmly. "I hope to make Wycliffe Manor a happy home." "I have no doubt you will, my lady. None at all." Julian showed Georgiana through the house personally, pointing out his favorite rooms and sharing stories from his childhood. Here was the library where he had spent countless hours reading after his brother's death. There was the music room where his mother had played the pianoforte, though it had been silent since she passed. This was the portrait gallery, where generations of Wycliffes stared down with varying degrees of sternness. "They all look rather forbidding," Georgiana observed, studying the painted faces. "We are a forbidding family," Julian replied. "Cold and proud and far too comfortable with our own superiority. It takes an extraordinary woman to see past that to the human beings beneath." "Then it is fortunate I am extraordinary," Georgiana said lightly, earning herself a rare, genuine smile from her husband. That evening, they stood together on the wide balcony outside the Marchioness's suite, watching the sun set over the moors. The sky was ablaze with color, deep golds and burning oranges fading into soft purples and blues. In the gardens below, birds were settling in for the night, their evening songs carrying on the cool breeze. "What are you thinking?" Julian asked, his arm around her waist. "That I am happy," Georgiana said simply. "Happier than I ever thought possible. 6 months ago, I was invisible, pitied at best, scorned at worst. I lived on charity and expected nothing more from life than continued existence in the shadows. She turned to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek. Then you saw me, truly saw me, not as a traitor's daughter or a burden or a victim, but as a woman of worth. You gave me back myself, Julian. You gave me the courage to believe I deserved more than society's leftovers. You deserved everything, Julian said fiercely. You still do. And now I have it, Georgiana replied. I have you. I have this beautiful home. I have respect and security and love. How did I become so fortunate? You did not become fortunate. You were always remarkable. The world simply failed to recognize it until I made them look properly. Georgiana laughed. You make it sound so simple. It is simple, Julian insisted. Love is recognizing worth where others see nothing. Protection is ensuring that worth is honored. Justice is punishing those who would harm what you love. Everything else is merely details. Your philosophy is rather ruthless, my lord. Perhaps, but it is effective. He pulled her closer, resting his chin on top of her head. I will never apologize for what I did to those men, Georgiana. They hurt you. They believed your lack of social standing made you fair game. I made certain every man in England understands the error of that assumption. I know, Georgiana said softly. And while part of me wishes you had not needed to go so far, I cannot pretend I do not appreciate the result. No one will dare touch me now. No one would dare even think of it, Julian corrected. The example has been set. The lesson has been learned. You are under my protection, and my protection is absolute. They stood in silence for a while, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Georgiana thought about the journey that had brought them here, the pain and humiliation of that terrible night, the weeks of healing, both physical and emotional, the shocking revelation of Julian's long-concealed feelings, the systematic destruction of her attackers, the unexpected proposal and hurried wedding. It had all happened so quickly, and yet it felt inevitable, as if every moment of her life had been leading her toward this man, this place, this happiness. What will we do now? She asked. We have the winter ahead of us, alone in this beautiful place. How shall we spend our time? Julian smiled, and it was the warm, genuine expression he reserved only for her. However you wish. We can read by the fire, walk the moors when weather permits. You can paint if you like. I can teach you to ride properly rather than the side-saddle nonsense society demands. We can simply exist together, learning each other, building a life. That sounds perfect, Georgiana said. And it was. The winter at Wycliffe Manor passed like a dream. Georgiana discovered that she loved the wild Yorkshire landscape, even in the depths of cold and snow. She would bundle up in warm cloaks and sturdy boots, and Julian would take her walking across the moors, pointing out landmarks and telling her stories of the estate's history. She painted, as he had suggested, setting up her easel near the windows where light flooded in. Her subjects were the views from various rooms, the gardens in their winter sleep, and sometimes Julian himself, though he protested that sitting still for portraits was torture. He taught her to ride astride, as he had promised, providing her with a riding habit that was shockingly modified to conceal breeches beneath the skirt, allowing for much greater freedom of movement. Mrs. Price looked scandalous every time she saw it, but Georgiana took to it immediately, reveling in the sensation of speed and control that side-saddle had never permitted. In the evenings, they would read together in the library, or Julian would play the pianoforte while Georgiana sang. He was surprisingly skilled at the instrument, his long fingers moving over the keys with the same precision he brought to everything he did. And Georgiana discovered that her voice, which had always been merely adequate in church, sounded beautiful in the acoustics of the music room, with Julian's playing supporting it. But more than any specific activity, it was the intimacy of daily life that made those months so precious. Learning his habits and preferences, discovering that he liked his coffee black and his breakfast substantial. that he read late into the night and was grumpy in the mornings until he had been awake for at least an hour, that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged only when he felt completely comfortable. And he learned her too, that she preferred chocolate to coffee, that she was most creative in the early morning light, that she had a gift for listening, for drawing people out and making them feel heard, that beneath her gentle exterior was a core of steel every bit as strong as his own. They made love with increasing confidence and tenderness, learning each other's bodies as carefully as they learned each other's minds. Julian was always patient, always attentive to her comfort and pleasure. And Georgiana discovered depths of passion in herself she had never suspected, responding to his touch with an abandon that would have shocked her former self. News from London arrived periodically through letters and newspapers. Lord Ravenscar had been transported to New South Wales to serve his sentence for forgery. Sir Neville Crofton was reportedly miserable in Scotland, his health deteriorating in the harsh climate. The Ton had moved on to fresh scandals, though the Wycliffe name was still spoken with wary respect. Georgiana's aunt wrote regularly from Cornwall, pleased at how well her niece had settled into married life. She reported that several of Georgiana's former acquaintances had attempted to claim closer friendship than they had actually shared, hoping to curry favor with the new Marchioness of Wycliffe. Georgiana found this amusing rather than bitter. She had learned that some people would always value connections over character. The Foundling Hospital sent a letter signed by every child in Georgiana's reading group, along with a drawing that showed a lady who was presumably meant to be her standing next to a very tall gentleman. Julian had it framed and hung it in his study, where visiting stewards and solicitors would ask about it with confused expressions. As winter gave way to early spring, Julian received word that his presence was required in London for the opening of Parliament. They discussed it over breakfast one March morning, the windows thrown open to admit the first warm breezes. "We need not go if you would prefer to remain here," Julian said. "I can send my proxy vote and stay in Yorkshire with you." Georgiana considered. Part of her wanted to remain in their comfortable isolation, where the outside world could not intrude. But another part, the part that had grown stronger over the winter, wanted to return to London as the Marchioness of Wycliffe and show society exactly what they had dismissed for so long. "Let us go," she said. "I am not afraid of them any more." Julian's eyes lit with approval. "No, you are not. Very well. We shall return to London for the season, but if at any point you wish to leave, we shall do so immediately." They arrived in London on a bright April morning to find Wycliffe House aired and ready, the staff having worked tirelessly to prepare for their return. The city was in full season mode, with the Ton returning from their country estates and the marriage market opening with renewed vigor. Georgiana's first public appearance as Marchioness was at a ball hosted by the Duchess of Hertford, one of the Ton's most influential hostesses. Julian had warned her that this would be something of a test. If the Duchess accepted Georgiana, the rest of society would follow. If not, they would face a difficult season. Georgiana dressed with care that evening, wearing a gown of deep sapphire silk that brought out the blue in her eyes. Her maid, young Martha, who had been promoted to lady's maid over the winter, arranged her hair in an elegant style threaded with small diamonds. The Wycliffe sapphires, which Julian's mother had worn, hung around her neck and sparkled at her ears. When she descended to the entrance hall where Julian waited, she saw his expression transform. "You are magnificent," he said simply. "I am nervous," Georgiana admitted. "Do not be. You are the Marchioness of Wycliffe. There is nothing and no one in that ballroom who can diminish you." He offered his arm. "Shall we go and remind them of that fact?" The ball was exactly as Georgiana remembered London balls from before her father's disgrace. Glittering chandeliers, beautiful gowns, the press of too many people in too small a space, the music of the orchestra competing with the roar of conversation. But this time, she did not enter through a side door hoping to avoid notice. She walked in on Julian's arm, announced by the butler in a voice that carried across the entire ballroom. the Marquess and Marchioness of Wycliffe. The effect was immediate. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Every eye in the room fixed on them with varying degrees of curiosity, surprise, and in some cases, barely concealed envy. The Duchess of Hertford, a formidable woman in her 60s who had been a beauty in her youth and remained commanding in her age, approached them directly. Georgiana's heart hammered as the Duchess studied her with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Then the Duchess smiled. "Lord Wycliffe, how delightful to see you at one of my balls. You usually avoid such events as if they carry plague." "I had no reason to attend before, Your Grace," Julian replied smoothly. "Now I have every reason." He turned to Georgiana. "May I present my wife, Georgiana?" The Duchess extended her hand to Georgiana, who curtsied with careful grace. "My dear child," the Duchess said warmly, "I knew your mother before she married. She was a lovely woman with excellent taste. I see you have inherited both qualities." It was a public stamp of approval, and Georgiana knew it. Relief flooded through her. "Thank you, Your Grace. You are very kind." "Kind nothing. I am honest." The Duchess glanced at Julian with something that might have been amusement. "I see you finally bestirred yourself to marry, Wycliffe. I had begun to think you intended to let your line die out in service to your precious pride." "My pride remains intact, Your Grace," Julian said dryly. "I simply found the one woman capable of tolerating it." The Duchess laughed. "Tolerating it? My boy, she has domesticated the ice Marquess. That takes more than tolerance. That takes courage." She patted Georgiana's hand. "Come and sit with me for a while, my dear. Let me introduce you properly to society. They will be much too intimidated by your husband to approach you otherwise." And so Georgiana spent the first hour of the ball seated beside the Duchess of Hertford, being introduced to a steady stream of ladies who came to pay their respects. Some were genuinely warm. Others were clearly calculating, but all of them were polite because the Duchess had made her position clear. Julian stood nearby, not hovering but present, a silent reminder that his wife had his full support and protection. Georgiana caught his eye occasionally and saw pride there, and love, and something that looked very much like relief. Later, when the dancing began, Julian claimed her for the first waltz. As he led her onto the floor, Georgiana was intensely aware of the eyes following them. This was the moment society would truly judge her, not by her conversation or her connections, but by how she moved in the Marquess's arms. The music began. Julian's hand settled at her waist, and they swept into the first turn. Georgiana had been worried about her skill, as she had learned the waltz from books rather than instruction. But Julian was such a strong lead that she found herself moving effortlessly, following his guidance without conscious thought. "You are doing beautifully," he murmured as they turned. "I am terrified I will trip on your feet. Then I will catch you. I will always catch you." By the third turn, Georgiana's fear had faded. She was actually enjoying herself, floating across the floor in her husband's arms while the ton watched and whispered, "Let them whisper. Let them judge. She was the Marchioness of Wycliffe, and she belonged here." When the waltz ended, Julian led her back to the Duchess, who nodded approvingly. "Well done, my dear. You dance beautifully together, though I suspect you do many things beautifully together." Her eyes twinkled with mischief that belied her years. The rest of the season passed in a whirl of social obligations, balls and dinners and music halls, morning calls and afternoon rides in Hyde Park, theater performances and visits to museums. Georgiana found herself surprisingly busy, and even more surprisingly, she found she enjoyed much of it. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer pitied. She was the Marchioness of Wycliffe, and that meant something in this world of carefully calibrated social standing. But she also made sure to maintain her connection to the Foundling Hospital. She visited every Tuesday and Thursday as before, though now she arrived in the Wycliffe carriage, and her donations were considerably more generous than they had been. The children did not care about her title. To them, she was still Miss Georgiana who read stories and taught them their letters. One afternoon in June, as she was leaving the hospital after her reading session, she encountered a young woman standing uncertainly near the entrance. The woman was perhaps 20, poorly dressed but clean, holding the hand of a small boy who could not have been more than 3. "May I help you?" Georgiana asked gently. The woman startled, then curtsied awkwardly. "Begging your pardon, my lady. I was told this is the place where children can be left if their mothers cannot care for them." Georgiana's heart clenched. "That is one of the hospital's purposes, yes, but perhaps we might talk first. Sometimes there are other solutions." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "There is no other solution, my lady. My husband died 6 months ago. I have been working at a tavern to support us, but the owner says I must choose between keeping my position and keeping my son. He does not want a child underfoot. And you need the position to survive." "I do, my lady. I have nowhere else to turn. My family disowned me when I married against their wishes. I thought perhaps if I left Timothy here, at least he would be fed and educated. Perhaps he might have a chance at a better life than I can give him." Georgiana looked at the little boy, who was clinging to his mother's skirts with big, frightened eyes. She thought of all the children inside the hospital, most of whom had been abandoned by parents who had no other choice. She thought of her own childhood, and how different it might have been if her father had made better decisions. "What is your name?" she asked the woman. "Mary Fletcher, my lady." "Well, Mary Fletcher, I think there might be another way." Georgiana made a decision that she knew Julian would support. "How would you like a position in my household? I am in need of additional staff, and if you are willing to work hard, I can offer you employment, living quarters, and a place for your son. He would be well cared for in the nursery while you work, and you would see him every day." Mary stared at her in disbelief. "You would do that? For me?" "For you and for Timothy," Georgiana said firmly. "Every child deserves to know their mother's love. Come, let us go to Wycliffe House now and get you settled." That evening, when Julian came home from Parliament, he found Georgiana in the nursery with young Timothy and 3 other children whose mothers worked in the house. She was reading them a story, her voice animated as she acted out the different characters. He stood in the doorway watching her, this remarkable woman he had married, and felt his heart expand with a love so fierce it was almost painful. She had taken everything society had thrown at her, every slight and humiliation, and had transformed it into compassion for others in similar circumstances. When the story ended and the children were led away to their supper, Georgiana came to him with a slightly defensive expression. "I know I should have consulted you before hiring Mary Fletcher. But she needed help, and I thought—" Julian silenced her with a kiss. "You thought correctly," he said when he pulled back. "This is your house as much as mine. If you wish to fill the nursery with every orphan and abandoned child in London, I will support you." "I do not wish to fill it with every child," Georgiana protested, "but perhaps a few, the ones who need help most desperately." "Then we shall help them," Julian said simply. "Together." And they did. Over the following months and years, Wycliffe House became known for its unusual household. The Marchioness employed women who had nowhere else to turn, provided education for their children, and created a community of support that was unprecedented among the aristocracy. Society whispered about it, of course. They said the Marchioness was eccentric. They said the Marquess indulged her peculiar notions. They said it was all terribly irregular, but they said it quietly and with respect. Because everyone remembered what had happened to the last 3 men who had thought the Marchioness unworthy of consideration. And no one, absolutely no one, wished to risk the Ice Marquess's wrath. 5 years after their wedding, Georgiana stood in the nursery of Wycliffe Manor, holding her daughter Catherine in her arms, while her 3-year-old son William played with wooden blocks on the floor. Outside, the moors were brilliant with summer heather, and the gardens were in full bloom. Julian entered the room, fresh from riding, and his face transformed as it always did when he saw his family. He kissed Georgiana's cheek, then scooped William up, making the boy shriek with laughter. "How were the tenants today?" Georgiana asked. "Prosperous and content," Julian replied. "The harvest will be excellent this year. We should be able to increase our donations to the hospital." "And perhaps establish a school in the village," Georgiana suggested. "The children here deserve the same education as the children in London." "Whatever you think best," Julian agreed, because he had long since learned that his wife's instincts about such matters were invariably correct. That evening, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Julian and Georgiana stood together on the balcony overlooking the moors, as they had done so many times before. The same stars wheeled overhead, the same wind carried the scent of heather and roses. But everything had changed. They had changed. The Ice Marquess had learned to love without reservation. The invisible daughter of a traitor had become a force for good in her community. Together, they had built something beautiful from the ashes of pain and humiliation. "Do you ever think about that night?" Georgiana asked quietly. "At Vauxhall Gardens?" "Sometimes," Julian admitted, "though less often now. The memory has lost its power to hurt." "Because justice was served?" "Because love was found," Julian corrected. "The justice was necessary, but the love is what matters. You matter. This matters." He gestured to the house behind them, where children slept safely and staff worked with dignity, and their own children grew up surrounded by books and beauty. "I never imagined I could be this happy," Georgiana said. "I thought happiness was for other people. People with good families and unblemished names." "Happiness is for people who fight for it," Julian said. "You fought, Georgiana. You survived your father's betrayal, society's scorn, and a brutal attack. You could have become bitter. You could have remained broken. Instead, you became this." He pulled her close. "Strong and compassionate and absolutely extraordinary. The thorns are gone, my love. Only the roses remain." "We became this," Georgiana corrected. "Together." "Together," Julian agreed. They stood wrapped in each other's arms as night deepened around them, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. Not perfection, but acceptance. Not ease, but partnership. Not fantasy, but real, complex, beautiful love. Behind them, Wycliffe Manor glowed with light from every window. Inside, their children dreamed. Their staff rested after a day's honest work. Their household thrived with the kind of warmth and security that came from being valued and respected. And on the moors beyond, the wind carried the promise of tomorrow, and all the tomorrows yet to come. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this journey. If stories of justice, redemption, and love that transforms even the coldest hearts have moved you, please subscribe and share this tale with someone special. Your support helps us continue creating stories that celebrate courage, resilience, and the power of love.